As I look back on the past decade and a half where comic book fans have endlessly been in praise, discussed, and continuous consumption of the endless productions of Marvel, DC, and other smaller projects from companies other than these ones, and the bottomless pit of executive drama surrounding these studios, and the controversial effects they have on both household audiences and cinema in general, I am not surprised that we as an audience find ourselves here. Love or hate these films, they are undeniably successful in the ways that matter for their longevity. As it seems, with a ton of sequels and remakes at play. But that's not the topic I chose to focus on this video. I'm here to focus on a film that can basically be talked about in the same breath as the other films I've mentioned mere moments ago. However, The Mask was a one-time cinematic experience with a ton of heart and substance put into its script that never had a real sequel that saw the light of day. And it's for that reason, among others, that I love this film. Man, that score is so infectious. To the uninitiated, The Mask is a live-action adaptation of the classic 1987 Dark Horse comic series, The Mask, about a young bank accountant, Stanley Ipkiss, who dons a magical mask that gives him immense and extraordinary powers in the fictional Edge City. 7 years after its first conception, the film was produced and distributed by New Line Cinema. Even though it was an adaptation, most audiences probably know the name of The Mask through this film rather than the comic book series that came beforehand. I certainly did, and 8-year-old me certainly did not at all give a damn at how faithful this film was to its aggressively dark and very grotesque original comic book. But the film is also very goofy, just roll with it. But in the initial development, The Mask was actually envisioned to be way darker and more faithful to its predecessor, as the director of the film, Chuck Russell, has stated behind the scenes. But through every revision, the film was then settled on to be a comedy to cater to a more balanced audience. But you can still definitely see the dark underbelly of this film showing in some of its scenes.
Sorry, wrong pocket.
Regardless, I'm not here to make complaints or arguments on if the film needed to be more faithful to the source material, or if the decision to censor the film to a certain degree was the better choice. But what I do want to discuss is how this film cemented itself as a comedy classic. And also maybe doing an analysis on how I would have rewritten the script to address some of the flaws I noticed upon a rewatch. Shall we? Part 1. The Mask of an Anti-Hero. The central theme of Stanley Ipkiss' story is to acquire a better understanding of oneself. And despite the overly mature subject matter and how anti-hero-like The Mask is, it is definitely what you'd expect from a typical live-action comic book adaptation of a superhero story. A nerdy and socially awkward individual with a crush on someone who is above their league acquires extraordinary powers to change their lives for the better and put an end to another individual's evil plot which would worsen the society they live in. And what they choose to do with that power will indicate the moral discussions of the story. All is set in a fictional city that looks like the second cousin of Gotham City. But even though the narrative substance of The Mask is the same as other superhero films, what does set it apart, however, is the anti-hero-like nature of The Mask. And on a side note, I can't think of a better choice of a performer to bring The Mask to life.
Spoken!
Jim Carrey owns and breathes the role, both in his awkward mannerisms and his over-the-top shenanigans. I've seen some critics say that Carrey is just pandering to his fan clubs and trying way too hard in the same way as he did with Ace Ventura and the Riddler, which is crazy in my opinion. He has already proven that he can act both the part of a socially awkward everyman and an energetic clown man. I mean, in a vacuum, these three characters are basically the same. So there's no reason to imagine anyone else in the role. But what is his story in the film?
I haven't exactly been myself lately.
Well, you don't look real fabulous, Stan.
Stanley takes part of a story where he has to figure out what type of individual he wants to be. To be selfless, self-interested, or tyrannical. But like most protagonists, he starts out at the bottom of the barrel. He is unconfident in his mannerisms towards women, he is unable to stand up for himself, and he just constantly encounters bad luck wherever he goes. This guy is a mess. But the benefit of introducing Stanley in this way is that the audience can very quickly pick up on the desire of someone whose world is completely against him. There is no need to incorporate any montages or monologues of Stanley dreaming about his desires. Oh, wait.
Tina, come on.
Okay, so there's one. But all of that changes when he dons the mask. It gives him otherworldly powers, and turns him into a more confident person with luck sitting in his lap. But in summary, the mask merely fulfills his desire. It's what he chooses to do with that mask that counts. And we can certainly do a similar thing where I did with my analysis on King Harold, where I take each event in the film and analyze his choices, but I instead want to give a broader analysis of the mask's appearance in the film. And to do that, we first have to look at the structure of the film. In other words, act organization.
Hold on, sugar. Daddy's got a sweet tooth tonight.
An act in a film is a section of the story that ends when the direction of the story changes or when the main character makes a choice to move forward in the journey. In The Mask, there are exactly 4 acts laid out in front of us. When looking at the scene organization of the film, each act can be separated into each time the mask appears on screen, with dramatic intervals in between following Stanley. Enough moments with the mask to make the film engaging, but not too much that it overpowers the film. And each scenario acts as building blocks to Stanley's journey that showcases his moral integrity. Act 1 is mainly dedicated to setting up Stanley, Tina, and Dorian as characters, and also to showcase Stanley's bad luck as an individual. But once he acquires the mask, the story kicks into maximum overdrive as he uses it for his own interest, and the first act ends when he wakes up the next morning. Act 2 is dedicated to raising the stakes by having a police detective investigate his acts as the mask, and also to give us the execution of Dorian's heist. And soon after, he dons the mask again in his iconic yellow suit. And this scene is just glorious. But again, he is using it for self-interested reasons. Act 3 explores the area of downfall for his character, but it's also where he is at his most ferocious. He gets another visit from the detective, and as a great payoff, he stands up to his boss and catches up with Tina to set himself up as the mask with her. And we get the beginning of the crisis segment where the mask gets captured by the police. Unsuccessfully, that is. Does the whole samba dance with the cops and gets betrayed by the reporter and then thrown into jail. His arrogance and self-interested use of the mask gets the better of him. We spent some time with Stanley and Tina as they discuss the mechanics of the mask, and the 4th act starts when Stanley decides to try and escape from the prison with Melo's help and gets to the club to retrieve the mask, but obviously he gets caught until Tina makes it a little easier for him to get it, but instead Melo does. And also, side note, how the hell is this even a reality? Like, come on, Dorian. How the hell are you gonna get beat up by a bank accountant? Anyway, Stanley retrieves the mask, and unlike his prior appearances, he uses the mask to put an end to Dorian's plan. He uses it for selfless reasons, and we get a send-off of him throwing the mask away with Tina choosing him. So here we have the entire layout of the film in terms of his appearance as the mask. And as far as I'm concerned, all of these scenes are sound to the story and push the narrative forward. Except for maybe the scene with him and the reporter where they talk about the effects of the mask, since we get a better discussion with him and Tina, but it's a minor scene. So none of the problems lie within the compositioning of the story. But if I were to make one change to the story, here's what I would do. Stanley's arc is all about learning to become selfless as a hero with the mask, and to gain confidence as a person without it. And with this diagram I'm showing you here, 3 out of 4 moments are here reserved for Stanley, attributing to the negative effects of the mask, and 1 moment where he fulfills his arc of becoming selfless at the climax. And if I were to rewrite this arc to be better, I would balance out the moral motives of these moments. As instead of having 3 moments of negative use of the mask and 1 that is positive, make it 2 moments of both worlds. Or at least insert a positive one in this section. In the first act, he learns about the beneficial but selfish reasons of the mask, and then the story can run the way it does until the end of his second appearance with his yellow suit. But then instead of immediately thrusting Stanley into a scenario where he just indulges with the negative effects of the mask, he can then be thrown into a scenario where he sees the positive benefit of the mask. Like, let's say he rescues a child from being trampled by a car. And once Stanley has learned the value of both moral worlds, he then has to decide once and for all what to do with the mask, which would be his character revealing decision. But then he could still choose to use it for his selfish reasons and then get punished for it, and the story can continue as follows. With this rewrite, Stanley would have a more elaborate and balanced character arc, where he understands both arguments surrounding the mask, and most importantly, this would add a bit more substance to his final moment with the mask, when he has to choose to do good with it, since he would have a pre-established motivation to do so. Now, I know what you're thinking. Rewriting the film like this would obviously be a big change in the film's faithfulness to the original comic book novel. After all, the comic book story is not a morality tale, and that would be true. But if the goal of the film is to turn Stanley into a confident and brave hero at the end, then the film has already taken creative liberties away from the novel, and therefore, this rewrite doesn't seem too alien. Superhero stories are morality tales, in essence, and The Mask obviously presents itself as one. And to have Stanley pick up on the important act of selflessness is the key to this video's next segment. Part 2. The Meaning of the Mask. There's a great sense of irony that can actually be found in the narrative expression of The Mask. More so than any superhero film that showcases a hero who sees fit to cover his face with a mask that is supposed to act as a symbol of heroism or morality. We already covered that The Mask is adapted as a morality story, but where the irony lies is within the how. Heroes like Spider-Man and Batman wear masks to embody a certain moral ideology, that being to inspire heroism in the good, or to strike fear in the bad. But the mask does the inverse, and the way it executes that inverse is one of the strongest parts of the story. There's a throwaway line in the film that is treated as comic relief, which is actually the most important line in the film.
We all wear masks, metaphorically speaking.
Not only is this a line that Stanley reiterates from a professor of philosophy— oh, hey, it's the Ferris Bueller guy.
Bueller.
But this line can basically be treated as the main thesis of the film. The Mask tells us a story about the effects of wearing a mask in the world. With every character we meet, we get a certain critique of this principle. With one exception, for reasons we'll get into later, all of the characters on screen wear a mask. Metaphorically speaking. Because the film is trying to provide a setup to the moral of the story through the narrative element. Stanley is always having bad luck with his superficial and direct mannerisms towards women, but not for the same reasons as the other characters around him. This is crystallized when Tina comes into the story. Now, even though on the surface she is just there to fill the slot of the love interest of the superhero, her inclusion in the film is way more important than you might realize. She is basically the want of every character in the film. Stanley wants her because he's in love with her, his buddy and boss simply want her attention, and Dorian the villain wants her as his sweet child in his criminal acts. And as previously mentioned, all of these characters outside of Tina are wearing masks. When Tina walks into the bank, his buddy puts on a charismatic act to try and charm her up. When she's mentioned as a client of Stanley in the newspaper, his boss asks him to send her over to him as if he's trying to do the same. These two are wearing masks of false womanizing identities. Dorian also wears a mask as he sees fit to cover up any involvement of his plans to rob the bank of Edge City, both from the cops and from his boss, whom both then belittle him for doing so. He is falsely masquerading as a civilian even though he is a criminal. Even the reporter who deceives Stanley into thinking that she likes him puts on a mask to betray him. There's only one person in the story who doesn't wear a mask on a metaphorical level, and that is Stanley. Ironic, right? Because he is wearing a physical mask. But the most brilliant part of the mask is that the story treats it almost like the dragon scroll from Kung Fu Panda, despite the power differences. Something that has the hierarchy of power and success, but the story is actually framed to treat it as a disposable plot instrument. It's not treated as a mascot of heroism or as a tool to strike fear, but rather as a microscope to enhance character. When Dorian puts on the mask, he becomes a dangerous force reflected by his criminal mind. And when Stanley puts it on, he becomes a goofier character reflected by his love of cartoons. But all of this is an illusion. After Stanley gets embarrassed at the nightclub in front of Tina, he comes to the belief that the mask is the only thing that can give him power to be with Tina. And even though that happens for a while, it's a false belief because in reality, the reason he fails in the story with her is because he is wearing the mask for his own sake of acquiring her. The same reason all of these characters fail with her. The scenes with Stanley and Tina basically tell us this. Tina acts as if she's interested in the mask, and therefore Stanley sees fit to continue his schemes. But in reality, what she really wants is someone who treats her as a normal being. Stanley doesn't try to charm her or grab her attention for his own pleasure. He is the only person who treats her as her own person, and not as a sexual figure or a pawn in a criminal chess game, whether that be to share a genuine conversation at a bank desk, act as an emotional guide, or to share a sunset with her on a park bench. It's for these reasons that once we get to the end of the film, Tina throws the mask away and chooses to be with Stanley, because he was ironically the only one who didn't wear a mask on a metaphorical basis. And that's why this film cuts so hard with its messaging. It tells us that real relationships are based on real interactions, and not the manipulative acts foregone by individuals who seek satisfaction through their masquerades. All in all, The Mask is a truly simple yet amazing film that provides a deconstructed look at what it means to wear a mask. And also, it's wickedly funny and entertaining to watch. I still every day come back to the Hey Pachuco scene, just to get a kick out of the music. And also because Jim Carrey is truly a cartoon in the flesh, in a good way. I am so glad this film never got a sequel, because imagine how that would have turned out, right? Right?